things that 13-year-old Abbie Gardner saw and experienced on March 8, 1857. Her father shot, listening to her mother and older sister murdered just outside the cabin, listening to her 5-year-old brother, 3-year-old nephew, 1-year-old niece murdered just outside the cabin, stepping over their dead bodies as she was pulled from the cabin into the woods, seeing her mother's hair, her mother's scalp, hanging from the belt of one of the Dakota Sioux men as they walked through the woods. Those things were going to stay with her for the rest of her life, every day for the rest of her life, for the next 63 years until she died at the age of 78. And there would be more, much more. Although it was probably no more than 20 degrees, I doubt that Abbie even felt the cold as they walked through the woods towards the Massacre cabin. And then they cleared the woods into the opening. Remember those 4 paintings that Abbie had commissioned later in her life to chronicle those things that she saw and experienced during the massacre and afterwards? This is one of those paintings. It's what she saw when she arrived at Maddox's cabin. The cabin was ablaze. There were 2 people trapped in the cabin or unable to get out. She could hear them scream and groan as they burned to death. There were 9 settlers, including children, laying around in front of the cabin, dead, some mutilated, all scalped. These were people that Abbie knew. 2 of them, Dr. Harriet and Mr. Snyder, had been at the Gardner cabin earlier in the day, telling Mr. Gardner, Roland, Abbie's father, that there was no need to worry, that the Indians, the Dakota, were just acting up. And now both men were part of a scene straight out of someone's worst nightmare. 5 men, 1 woman, 5 children, 11 in total, died at that cabin. Abbie was pushed into one of the teepees. It was clear to her that she was not to move. She lay inside, huddled against the far edge of the teepee, and waited for what she thought was going to be her own death. At one point, a warrior entered the teepee, pulled and loaded a revolver as if he was going to shoot her, drew back the hammer and held it to her head. She quietly bowed her head and waited. The warrior was amused, and he laughed loudly. The warrior told everybody who entered the teepee after that the story he thought was funny. But never again did anyone in the band point a weapon at her, with the exception of a woman at one time later on. Abbie may have won a measure of respect from the Dakota Sioux, but that wasn't really it. It wasn't bravery. It was the fact that she longed for death at that point and didn't care. Sometime that same day, that first day, the Dakota crossed the frozen lake to the Granger cabin, where they found one individual, Carl Granger, and they killed him, and their rage continued to show. They severed his head from above the eyes and left him dead in the snow. By the end of that first day, Sunday, March 7, 1857, the Dakota Sioux had killed 21 people, 8 of whom were children. That night, Abbie recalled that the Dakota Sioux did the scalp dance throughout the night. They circled round and round, wild screams, a drum, until they were exhausted. And what happened to Abbie inside that tent that night, and for that matter, on all the other nights? Was it like the three women who were taken by the Dakota Sioux in Peterson, Iowa, weeks earlier, where they were assaulted by the Dakota men all night? And why do we want to know? The second question is easier, at least it is for me. My interest in Abbie Gardner started when I read her story and tried to understand and appreciate the pain and suffering that she went through. That continues to be something I want to know about. And to know about that, you need to know what happened to her fully. The first question, was Abbie Gardner treated the same way the three women down in Peterson were treated earlier? This is a harder question because even after all of these years, I don't want it to be true. In the book that she first published in 1885 when she was 42 years old, 28 years after the massacre, Abbie doesn't say anything about whether or not she was assaulted by the Dakota men. I don't think that's surprising at all. But you may recall that there was an earlier book published in 1857, just months after the massacre. This one by Lorenzo Porter Lee, an officer in the Army who was assigned to help Abbie move from St. Paul after her rescue to Iowa. And he had time to talk with her and reported what she told him about her captivity. Colonel Lee wrote in his book that Abbie told him that every night she was compelled to do what her, quote, tyrant ordered her to do, or she would have been killed. And so with that, and all of the other circumstances, I think it's pretty clear that poor little Abbie endured it all. And by the way, the picture on the cover of Colonel Lee's book is from a drawing of Abbie at the time of her rescue, 84 days after the massacre. The break of dawn the next morning, Monday, March 9, 1857, the second day of the massacre, Abbie was pulled out of the teepee by two Dakota Sioux women. They made it clear that they wanted her to gather firewood from the woods. They walked along with her as she did that. Abbie's face, the 1,000-yard stare. She could smell the smoke from the still smoldering cabin. She could see the people she knew dead on the snow around the cabin. At some point during the night, the Dakota Sioux women began to disguise Abbie. They took her shoes and gave her moccasins, harder to track that way. They took her dress and gave her the clothes that Dakota Sioux women would be wearing. Later, they would perfect the disguise by saturating her hair with animal grease, grease from any animal really, a dead deer or possum, beaver or skunk. And then they would braid that hair tightly. They would reapply that grease on a regular basis. Later, they would apply a red pigment to her face, giving it a darker appearance. The disguise was effective. It would be difficult for anyone, especially at any distance, to determine that Abbie was a white girl. As Abbie dropped off her first load of wood on the pile, she looked up and saw the 8 men. They were applying war paint, black war paint, around their eyes. They then turned and trotted off in single file. She recognized at least 4 of them as being the same ones who killed her family and took her. And she knew from the direction that they were heading, toward the Howe cabin, that more people that she knew were going to die that day. And for the rest of her life, she carried the guilt of knowing at that moment she was unable to feel anything about what was going to happen to them. One of the Dakota women pushed her back towards the woods. and she did what she was told. It was a horrible morning for Joel Howell that day. He was on his way from his cabin to the Massacre cabin, about 3 miles away, to see if they could spare some flour. He was unaware of the violence at the Gardner, Maddock, and Granger cabins the day before. As he walked along the shoreline towards the Maddock cabin, he saw 8 men approaching, the same 8 Dakota Sioux warriors Abbie saw leave the Maddock cabin area earlier, and it was too late when he discovered they were Dakota Sioux wearing war paint. They killed Joel Howell, severed his head, and threw it into the lake, where his skull was discovered about 2 years later. And then one of the most shocking and sad things in this whole story happened. The Dakota Sioux rushed the Howe cabin. Joel Howe's wife, Millie Howe, she saw the Dakota Sioux coming, and she hid under the bed in that one-room cabin, while the Dakota Sioux killed all 6 of her young children in that same cabin. The Dakota Sioux warriors then moved another mile to the northeast, to the Thatcher cabin. Actually, there were 2 families living there. Joseph Thatcher with his wife, Elizabeth Thatcher, and their one child, a 3-year-old baby girl, Dora, and Elvin Noble and his wife, Lydia Noble, and one child, Jonathan, age 2. There was also a single man living there, Enoch Ryan. Joseph Thatcher was not there at the time. He was away getting supplies. The Dakota shot both Elvin Noble and the single man, Enoch Ryan, dead. Noble, when he was shot, cried out, quote, "Oh, I am killed," before falling dead. The Dakota seized 2-year-old Jonathan, Lydia Noble's son, and 3-week-old baby girl Dora, Elizabeth Thatcher's daughter, held them by their feet and hit them against an oak tree until they were dead. Lydia Noble and Elizabeth Thatcher saw that. It's hard to imagine that agony. In fact, as our story goes on, you'll see that Lydia Noble and Elizabeth Thatcher never did really recover from that. And then, like Abbie Gardner, the Dakota Sioux decided to spare Lydia Noble, age 20, and Elizabeth Thatcher, age 19, and instead take them. And they started back to their camp at the Maddock cabin. For some reason, the Dakota Sioux decided to stop at the Howe cabin again, maybe to do some more looting. And that's when they discovered Millie Howe hiding under the bed. They dragged her out, beat her to death, and scalped her. And this time, when they left the Howe cabin, Millie Howe was laying dead in the cabin among the bodies of all of her children. The Dakota headed back that 3 to 4 miles to their camp at the Maddock cabin. Day 2 of the Spirit Lake Massacre was over. 34 people, settlers, dead, 16 of whom were children. 3 taken prisoner, Abbie, age 13, Elizabeth Thatcher, age 19, Lydia Noble, age 20. That night, more misery and fear and terror for all 3 of those captives. At that point, the end of day 2 of this revenge raid by the Dakota Sioux, they may have thought that the whites were not aware of what they were doing. Turns out they were wrong about that. The Dakota were not aware of Morris Markin. He was a settler who was out looking for some oxen who had been lost when, on day 2 of the massacre, March 9, 1857, He stopped at the Gardner cabin about 11 p.m. to see if he could get out of the cold and discovered that the Gardner family had been massacred. Markin moved as quickly as he could to get to the Massacre cabin to get some help, only to discover that the Dakota Sioux were camped there. He managed to avoid the Dakota, and nearly freezing to death, he moved from one cabin to the other, the Granger cabin, to the Howe cabin, to the Thatcher cabin, looking for anyone who might be alive. They were all dead. And so he moved further east until he came to the cabin of George Granger. He told Granger that his brother had been killed by the Dakota. And the next day, March 10, the third day of the massacre, Morris Markin and George Granger headed for Springfield, 17 or 18 miles to the north, to sound the alarm and get help. On March 10, 1857, day 3 of the massacre, Inkpaduta breaks camp at the Madoc cabin, crosses the frozen West Lake Okoboji, and camps somewhere on the west side of the lake. The next day, March 11, day 4, Inkpaduta again breaks camp and moves further north, close to the Marble cabin. During those 2 days of travel, Abbie quickly finds out what she is supposed to be now. She's supposed to be a pack animal. She's supposed to be what she called a slave of the slaves. And she finds out that survival is not going to be easy. On March 12, 1857, day 5 of the massacre, the Dakota discover that there's yet another cabin, a marble cabin, near their camp. They stay in camp that day, feasting on whatever food they were able to steal from the settlers they massacred. It was the next day, March 13, 1857, day 6 of the massacre, when the paint went back on and the Dakota warriors visited the Marble cabin. They shot Mr. Marble, scalped him, and his 17-year-old wife, Margaret Marble, they took her. On March 14, 1857, day 7 of the massacre, with the sleighs loaded with supplies and food that they had taken from their victims, Inkpaduta headed north towards Minnesota and the village of Springfield. The massacre at Spirit Lake was over, but the killing wasn't over yet. So far, Inkpaduta's small band had killed 35 people, 16 of whom were children. And the Dakota now had 4 captives: Abbie Gardner, age 13, Margaret Marble, age 17, Elizabeth Thatcher, age 19, and Lydia Noble, age 20. In Springfield, Abbie Gardner's one remaining family member, her sister Eliza, she lives in Springfield.